As conflict blocks Middle Eastern trade routes, Canadian energy could see increased demand.
We are even more important today than we were before the weekend.
But can Canada replace oil and gas from the Gulf states?
And the answer is yes.
While 150 oil tankers sat stranded outside the Strait of Hormuz and global energy markets were in complete freefall, Canadian energy executives were quietly receiving the most important phone calls of their careers. The calls weren't coming from Washington. They were coming from Seoul, Beijing, and Tokyo. Canada just broke its own oil production records for the third consecutive year. And the crisis that froze the world's most important shipping lane is exactly the reason why. On February 28th, the Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down. That narrow waterway handles roughly 20% of the world's entire daily oil supply. Almost overnight, 150 tankers were frozen in place, unable to move. Crude prices crossed $100 a barrel within days. Across Canada, gas prices jumped 40 cents a litre in just 3 weeks. The International Energy Agency described it as the largest oil supply disruption ever recorded in modern history. The countries hit hardest weren't small economies on the edge of the map. South Korea sources approximately 70% of its oil from the Middle East. Practically overnight, the fuel powering its entire manufacturing sector was cut off. Major production hubs across Asia were staring at a catastrophic shortfall with no obvious solution in sight. The global energy supply chain had just broken in the most public way possible. But while the headlines were focused entirely on the breakdown, something different was happening in the actual trade data. Official government figures released this week confirmed that Canada's refined petroleum sector posted its highest production year ever recorded in 2025, hitting 117.1 million cubic meters. Crude oil production averaged 5.3 million barrels per day across the year. These weren't numbers posted in calm conditions. Canada broke its own production record 3 consecutive years in a row, and the most recent record was set while the global energy market was in genuine chaos. The infrastructure that made this possible was already running at full capacity before the crisis started. The Trans Mountain Pipeline currently moves Canadian oil directly to the west coast, where tankers load and cross roughly 9,000 kilometers across the North Pacific to reach buyers in Asia. That route bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Malacca entirely. To understand why this matters so much right now, you have to understand what Asian refiners were actually looking for the moment Hormuz went dark. They needed oil priced competitively. They needed supply available immediately. And most critically, they needed a shipping route that didn't pass through an active conflict zone. The Trans Mountain Corridor offered all three at the same time. Chinese buyers had already become the pipeline's single largest customer before the shutdown happened. When the crisis hit, South Korean refiners activated emergency import plans to bring in Canadian crude within days. This wasn't improvised scrambling. It was years of infrastructure investment and quiet relationship building paying off at exactly the right moment. The Pacific route wasn't a backup plan. It turned out to be the most reliable energy corridor on the planet. Here is the part of this story that almost nobody is covering. The narrative everyone expected was Canada managing its way through an external shock. The actual story is the complete opposite. On the US Gulf Coast, American refineries are specifically engineered to process heavy crude oil. The feedstock those refineries require typically comes from 3 sources: Canada, the Middle East, or Venezuela. With Hormuz closed and Venezuelan output chronically unreliable, American Gulf refiners were suddenly facing a serious shortage of the exact type of crude their equipment is built to run on. At the same time, South Korean manufacturers desperate for stable supply were competing for the same Canadian barrels. For the first time, American refineries and Asian manufacturers were effectively bidding against each other for Canadian crude. The leverage in this relationship had completely and structurally shifted. That shift is now walking directly into the trade negotiation room. CUSMA renegotiations are approximately 2 months away. For years, the working assumption inside Washington trade circles was that the United States held most of the leverage in any negotiation with Canada. The physical reality of the current global energy market is telling a very different story. Prime Minister Carney's government is also facing a major infrastructure decision in roughly 6 weeks on the Prairie Connector pipeline, If approved, that project would move an additional 450,000 barrels of Canadian oil per day into the US market. That is not an abstract policy number. That is a concrete supply line that American refiners on the Gulf Coast are actively counting on. Whether that approval moves forward, stalls, or becomes conditional is now a direct instrument of trade leverage sitting on Carney's desk heading into negotiations. This also translates into something Canadians can feel directly. Every major Canadian pension fund holds significant energy sector investments. When producers break production records and oil is trading at elevated prices, those funds perform better, which protects retirement savings for millions of Canadians. Provincial royalty revenues climb, which funds healthcare and local infrastructure without adding pressure to the federal budget. The recent 10-cent cut to the federal fuel tax at the pump is a direct downstream result of the revenue cushion this sector has generated. The same energy leverage driving Canada's position at the CUSMA table is also the mechanism behind real relief Canadians are already seeing at the gas station, but the window is not permanently open. The Trans Mountain Pipeline physically maxes out at around 890,000 barrels per day. Once the Strait of Hormuz stabilizes and traditional Middle East suppliers come back online, some of this new Asian demand will naturally return to closer, established sources. The current moment of maximum leverage has a clock on it. The question that Canada's negotiators and energy executives are now racing to answer is whether they can convert this temporary crisis advantage into permanent long-term trade relationships before the disruption ends and the global market rebalances. The infrastructure did exactly what it was built to do. Whether the deals get done in time is a completely different question.